This is a big week, I know, because it's midterm week. So a reminder, in the case that any of you may have forgotten that your midterm is on Thursday, in this room at this time, bring your blue books, and at the end of this lecture, we'll go over like maybe one idea and one essay, a question, just to, I know you've already done that with Katie and Carrie, but we'll do it again. So you are fully prepared. So for those of you who got here very early, you heard two clips of music there. The first was Jack Hilton, who was born near Bolton in the turn of the 19th century, became a big, very popular leader of one of the dance bands in the 1920s and 1930s, and the other was Jamie T. I forget which track from the Kings and Queens album. The other thing I have to remember to do is to remind any of you who want to do a research paper that haven't emailed me yet to do so really in the next 24 hours, okay? We've got a great list of potential topics that people are interested in, and I'm always happy to talk to you about it, but right now all I need is a declaration of intent. This week is also a big week because we are moving into a new phase of the class. That is to say, that this week and next week, and indeed for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking to you really about the legacies of the First World War, and trying to explore what type of changes it generated. And the fundamental question we're going to be looking at is, did Britain, after the First World War, try and return to the principles of liberalism that had served it so well in the 19th and early 20th century, primarily associated with free trade, the gold standard, imperial expansion, and a sort of belief in industrial progress? Or did it move towards a different vision of how you organize economic and social life? A vision that would put increasing emphasis upon the state playing a much more active role in the regulation of the economy and society. Next Tuesday, after your midterm, I'll talk to you about the economic consequences of war and the responses to them. Today, this lecture is primarily concerned with the political and cultural effects of the war. But really, the two lectures are coupled, as you will see. The starting point really has to be to remember that rather like the Holocaust was for the post-1945 generation, the First World War served as, if you like, the ultimate test case of the nature of the modern world that existed. Had the modernity that societies had been searching for and building towards resulted in this massive carnage and destruction? Or was there something redeemable about the project of modernization? And in the Britain's case, the path of liberal modernization that they had pursued. Many people feared that the war was not just a consequence of that process of liberal modernization and progress, but that it had brutalized the population. That society was literally left in a new, more violent, more disorderly, more chaotic state as a consequence. And there was a good deal of anxiety about what the new democracy that had been created in 1918, with all but a handful of conscientious objectors and women under 30 not included, what that new democratic settlement that followed the war would bring. Bear in mind, of course, this is in the shadow of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Okay? So the great fear is that democracy would lead to the forward march of the labor movement, the embrace of socialism, and, in the worst possible case, Bolshevism and a revolution. Worse still, it was feared that this tide of unrest, potential unrest and popular mobilization, wouldn't just stop in Britain. Indeed, it was the great concern that it would spread right across the empire. And as we'll see later in the lecture, 1919, the year of the great demobilization of the army and the colonial troops as well, was a moment of dramatic political crisis across the empire. There were revolts and revolutions and anti-colonial mobilizations in Iraq, in Egypt, in Ireland, in India, in the Caribbean, in Somaliland, and in Afghanistan. And there was widespread strikes and unrest in Britain in that year as well. In fact, such was the parlous state of Britain's economy after the war, as we'll see next week. There were a whole series of attempts to try and put the economy back on track that led to a rising tide of industrial unrest that produced the first ever general strike in Britain, when the entire organised labour movement went out on strike and paralysed the country for the best part of a week. So, enormous sense of chaos and impending catastrophe. Now, there were basically two responses to this, and this is the key point that I'm going to explore in the next couple of lectures. The first was a turn towards an idea of scientific planning, that the only way to lift Britain and the empire out of this morass was to adopt a scientific form of government planning and government intervention into economic and social life. And of course, this strand would eventually lead to the development of an entirely new political settlement and the construction of a welfare state in the 1940s. But the other response, okay, which in some ways you should think of as the exact opposite, but in another way I want to suggest to you is intricately related, was an attempt to reimagine Britain as a sort of ideal, as an ideal liberal nation. And it's very important that when this happens, it's always England that is referred to, never Britain. Okay? There's a particular form of English nationalism that returns in the wake of the First World War and places increasing emphasis on that English character, the character of England, as providing the clue to a new type of stability and consensus. Okay? So some people are basically thinking after the war, okay, we're going to embrace a brand new world, a brave new world even, full of science and planning, and the other people are thinking, no. We fought the war so that we could restore liberal Britain. We could restore the old order, and we could find the essential stability within it that was so important to the 19th century. And so, I'm going to suggest to you today that we can see this process at work under these four different headings. The reconstruction of domestic life, the attempt to put together the battered relations of men and women and the so-called sex war, the pursuit of stability in suburbia and in rural England, a new type of conservative politics that develops to capture this, and to not just to capture, but to create this new mood, and finally a new relationship to empire. Indeed, some historians have even suggested that what you see in the First World War is a decisive shift away from the masculine imperial rhetoric of the Edwardian period, the militarism, the sense of heroic manly adventure, and that what emerges in the 20s and 30s is a shift towards a new interior domestic landscape. Okay? I think there are real problems with that analysis, as you see when we get to the empire. The empire is actually still very much part of this project. Okay, enough of introductions. Let's move on. So the first thing I want to talk about is the attempt to rebuild relations between men and women. And this should be seen in two contexts. First, the idea that, you know, for at least 2 decades before the First World War, the sex war, the battle between men and women, the representation of men in negative terms by women as they were campaigning for the vote, okay, had to be mended. Okay? And the second is this impossible emotional gap that had opened up between the experiences of men and women during the First World War, with people like my grandfather incapable of being able to talk about the experiences that he had experienced. And I'm going to do this in 3 headings. I'll talk about new feminism, what happens to feminism, how they try and adapt in the 1920s. I'll talk about married love, the new idea of a mutual a reciprocal relationship between men and women. And finally, very briefly, I'll talk about new forms of domesticity. Okay, so let's touch on the new wave of feminism that happens after the First World War. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which had been that moderate constitutional wing of the women's suffrage movement, headed by Millicent Fawcett, had got rebranded, basically, in 1920 and was renamed the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship. Okay? Now, that was partly a consequence of the enfranchisement of some women in 1918. It was under the leadership of Eleanor Rathbone, who you see before you, and she began to articulate a new vision of feminist politics in the 1920s and the 1930s. The National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship developed a 6-point charter, rather like the Chartists. Okay? There's a very important echo of Chartism here. It's equal pay for equal work, a very important emphasis there. An idea of an equal standard on questions of sexuality and of morality. Remember that the exposure of the double standard of the treatment of prostitutes had been a driving force of a certain strand of the suffrage movement before the war. And they wanted to create more fairer divorce laws, etc., etc. Third point was the introduction of pensions for civilian widows and their children. Okay, military. There had been military pensions, but they wanted civilian pensions for widows. Fourth, most obviously, they wanted the rest of women to get the vote, the equalization of the franchise, so that was a universal franchise, not a partial franchise for women. Fifthly, they wanted the legal recognition of mothers as the equal guardians of children, so that fathers didn't have effective legal control